Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking an X-ray of one of the most mythic, ambitious, and internally contradictory families in American history,
Right.
the Kennedys. We're focusing specifically on the patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., and the political machine he built around his sons, Jack, Bobby, and Teddy.
And this deep dive, it's built on just an immense stack of sources that goes far, far beyond the public narrative. We're looking not just at the political triumphs, the visible edifice of Camelot, but at the deeply human, often calculated, and sometimes ruthless architecture that allowed this dynasty to rise. It's really an immersion into the engine room of ambition.
Right. And our mission for you, the learner, is to quickly grasp the operational facts here. We need to understand how immigrant hustle morphed into this Brahmin aspiration, how intense sibling rivalry became a crucial political accelerant, and perhaps most surprisingly, how profound personal vice and physical frailty were expertly managed and even leveraged on the path to the White House. We're cutting through decades of myth to examine the structure beneath.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sons, you absolutely have to understand the father. So we have to start right at the foundation. The immigrant context and the cold, calculated, almost immediate rise of Joe Kennedy Sr. He's the man who fundamentally set the rules for what it meant to be a Kennedy.
So the story begins in East Boston with Joe Sr.'s father, PJ. Now, PJ was shrewd. The sources note his deep insight into all the machinations of human beings. He was a successful saloon owner, a local politician.
Right, fish in a small pond.
Exactly. But PJ's ambition was, fundamentally contained. He was content with East Boston as world enough for himself and for his son.
Joe Sr., however, absorbed all of his father's shrewdness, that keen insight into human motivations, but he paired it with this relentless, burning drive he inherited from his mother. The sources describe her as having overweening ambition. And that combination, it created a generational leap. Joe Sr. wasn't going to settle for being the king of a local ward. He wanted the keys to the entire city, and eventually, the nation.
And we see immediately how intensely observant Joe Sr. was of his environment. He viewed East Boston as this massive, volatile crucible of ethnic shifts.
Precisely. You have to picture it. Joe is witnessing the Irish, who had dominated the area for a long time, starting to pull out to assimilate into better neighborhoods. And at the same time, Eastern European Jews and Italians are flooding in, crammed into these triple-decker houses and tenements.
So it's not just a demographic shift, it's a perceived threat.
It's an economic and social threat perception.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly note that these new arrivals, particularly the Jews, were viewed by the established Irish Americans as an exotic, threatening element. So Joe understood from a very young age that ethnic identity was currency, and that currency was always fluctuating.
And that understanding, it translated directly into these early, deeply cold political and social calculations. I mean, even when he was just a student. The anecdote about Boston Latin School is maybe the most defining early story of Joe Sr.'s pragmatism.
Oh, it's the perfect blueprint. It's the perfect blueprint for everything that comes later. He recognized he needed social currency that his family's wealth couldn't automatically buy, so he identifies Walter Elcock.
Elcock was the golden boy, the best athlete, captain of the football team.
Guaranteed captain of the baseball team. And Joe knows he can't outcompete him athletically, so he doesn't even try. He executes a subtle social transaction instead.
He starts taking Elcock to these steak dinners.
Right, which the sources highlight was a luxury Elcock wouldn't typically get at home. He's using this social lubrication, creating an implied bond, a kind of debt. And then he talks Elcock into stepping aside.
Wait, so the actual physical captain of the team was persuaded to just step down, purely for social cachet.
Yes. So that Joe could be captain of both the football and baseball teams in name and deed for 2 years in a row. It was Joe buying visible leadership. He traded something of low value to himself, a fancy meal and social attention, for something of immense value. Undisputed, visible, athletic leadership, which conferred status. This lesson, that social position can be transacted, not just earned, is one he built his entire career on.
And his most crucial personal calculation was, of course, marrying into the right bloodline to cement his social ascent, his romance with Rose Fitzgerald. I mean, she was the daughter of the formidable Boston politician Honey Fitz.
For her, it was high adventure. For Joe, it was a high-stakes calculation.
And a very risky move for Rose, wasn't it, given the intensely severe, almost terrifying Catholic warnings of the time?
Oh, absolutely. The sources detail how these religious guides provided terrifying warnings about protecting one's virginity, equating its loss with, losing life itself. So for her to marry the daughter of a powerful, publicity-possessive politician who had even served 3 terms in Congress?
while living 16 miles outside his own district, which shows his political detachment from the local Boston scene.
Exactly. It was Joe Sr.'s move to leverage political royalty. He wasn't just marrying a woman, he was merging dynasties.
Marrying Rose Fitzgerald was the final step out of East Boston, but the real ticket to the American pinnacle was Harvard. And this was not the expected path. I mean, the son of a leading Catholic politician was supposed to attend Boston College.
But Joe sought the pinnacle of American life. The sources confirm he entered Harvard in 1908 despite an abysmal academic record at Boston Latin. He actually had to repeat his last year, making him older than his classmates.
So the choice of Harvard wasn't about grades or intellectual pursuit.
Not at all. It was about positioning. Harvard dominated the city's intellectual, social, and athletic life. It was where American power was cultivated.
And the sources note this interesting irony about his academic performance. His mediocre grades suggested he wasn't overly concerned with what the professors called arid pedantries.
Right. He was effectively avoiding becoming what Teddy Roosevelt famously criticized as an over-civilized man, someone too intellectualized to actually lead.
He was focused on networking, not studying.
He was interested in the environment that produced power, and the Brahmin world he aspired to enter came with a very specific, almost moral expectation about wealth. The Boston elite had developed this idea that great charity is the natural concomitant of great wealth.
So you couldn't just be rich, you had to be seen as virtuous.
Exactly. Joe understood that to stand with the Brahmin elite, he couldn't just spend inherited wealth that was seen as a pallid pleasure. He had to be seen as a man of beneficence. This forced him to adopt the trappings of virtue, even if his methods of acquiring that wealth were anything but virtuous. It was pure performance.
And this ambition played out ruthlessly in what the sources call the final club's gauntlet. These were these private, highly exclusive clubs that acted as the ultimate social gatekeepers to the Brahmin scene. Joe Sr. knew winning this gauntlet was essential for the family name.
And he executed some shrewd social maneuvering to ensure his election. He was chosen for the Dickey, which was just a massive achievement. To understand why, you have to understand the odds. In a typical year, out of the 116 men chosen for the first selection step, the Institute of 1770, only about 4 roomed outside the exclusive Gold Coast.
And the Gold Coast, just for our listeners, refers to the private dormitories that only the old money, established Boston families could afford.
Right, that's right. These were the wealthy, established Protestant families. Joe was a Catholic from East Boston. He was one of the very, very few non-Gold Coast men who navigated this brutal social plebiscite successfully. It proved he could master the Brahmin rules, even as an outsider.
But the sources remind us that even this victory came with a profound cost. It blurred the lines between the sacred field of play and the sordid duplicities of the outside world. The baseball anecdote is the lesson that truly defines his later ruthlessness.
It's damning. Joe was dismissed from the A baseball squad, which was a major personal humiliation for him. But just a few days before the critical final Yale game, his father's friends intervened. They used leverage, specifically movie theater licenses, to pressure the senior captain into ensuring Joe got playing time. Just enough so he could win his letter.
So Joe Sr. got his letter, not through skill or effort, but through corruption leveraged by his father's political connections.
And that's the critical takeaway. The sources say Joe didn't care how he won. He learned that the rules of the game were optional if you had the right leverage. This lesson, that the end justifies the means and that wealth and power are interchangeable currencies, that would become the primary engine of the entire Kennedy dynasty. He had secured his privilege, but by sacrificing any pretense of integrity in the process.
So once Joe Sr. had bought his way into the Brahmin world, the great project shifted entirely. The construction of the perfect Kennedy sons. And that started with Rose. She viewed her children, especially given her husband's constant indiscretions, as her one true legacy.
And Rose's approach to child rearing was almost pathologically scientific. She was a literalist who applied the ideas of modern scientific experts. She treated strict regularity and schedule adherence as a moral imperative. It was all about control and perfection.
And the details of this regimen, following the care and feeding of children by a Dr. L. Emmett Holt, are, well, they're intense.
They're extreme. It dictated that babies must be fed and put to sleep at exactly the same time every day and evening. No exceptions. Furthermore, they were to be fed for no longer than 20 minutes, and if they started falling asleep during that window, they had to be kept alert by gentle shaking until they finished.
Wow. That creates this mechanical, high-pressure environment right from birth. Deviation from the schedule was treated almost as a moral failure.
It sets a powerful psychological foundation of intense, non-negotiable discipline. And it's important to understand the broader cultural context of discipline, especially around sex and marriage, which the sources also reveal.
Right. The sexual landscape of the time was defined by fear, particularly within Catholic morality.
The sources reveal these intensely conservative views regarding marital sex. It had to be carefully rationed. And this wasn't just about piety, it was linked directly to productivity.
That's astonishing. How on earth do they link sex to productivity?
Well, experts at the time warned against indulging gluttonously every night. The reason cited was that it would inevitably lead to neurasthenia or nervous prostration for the wife. But for the husband, and this is the key insight, it decreased his business efficiency. Furthermore, too frequent or unnatural indulgence risked the most desperate cases of paralysis and epilepsy.
So the goal of marital intimacy was not connection or pleasure. It was controlled, efficient procreation that did not interfere with the man's ambition.
Exactly. Even the most private aspect of life, the marital bed, was governed by the imperative of business success and patriarchal control. It just echoes Joe Sr.'s priorities perfectly. It truly establishes a culture where performance and efficiency trumped all else.
And into this intensely disciplined environment came Joe Sr.'s expectations for his sons. He was determined to ensure they avoided being prissy inheritors.
Right. He wanted a very specific blend. A gentleman and an athlete, a democrat and an aristocrat. And he would use his wealth, the thing the Brahmins equated with virtue, to push them up the great road of political power.
This required a performance of ruggedness. And this is the genesis of the famous roughnecks, right? Rose, ironically, was the one who insisted on this. She was fearful of making the sickly Jack a mommy's boy because of his constant ailments.
So after school, Joe Jr. and Jack would change into these coarse garments that made them look like roughnecks, and their actions matched the attire perfectly. They were genuinely wild. The sources tell us they scribbled hot before dogs on a no dogs allowed sign. They stole false mustaches from a store. They even formed a club where the initiation involved sticking pins into them.
So they were notorious. One neighbor boy wasn't even allowed to play with them. This was not a refined, privileged upbringing. It was a forced, competitive, roughneck masculinity.
And all that rough energy was focused and amplified by the intense sibling rivalry. This was a dynamic Joe Sr. actively cultivated. He watched them, as the source says, like a promoter who owned both boxers. And the early divide between the two eldest boys was striking.
You had Joe Jr., the physical and social exemplar.
Healthy, vibrant, his father's namesake, and the clear favorite. He was the eventual winner of the Choate Prize for combining scholarship and athletics, the definition of the successful first son.
And then there was Jack, the perpetual second son, struggling physically from the very beginning.
Jack was described as a scrawny, whining, sickly tyke, always suffering from something. He had weak knees, bad arches that required special built-up shoes, and various constant illnesses. At one point, he even had a false diagnosis of leukemia. The infirmary, the sources confirm, was his second home. He was the living embodiment of the frailty his father sought to avoid.
And in that competitive climate, weakness wasn't met with sympathy, but with antagonism. There's a story where Jack once viewed his sick older brother, Joe Jr., who got ill around Thanksgiving, with what he called sweet vengeance. He boasted in a letter home that he threw Sikkim over on his neck during Indian wrestling.
And that's the family dynamic in a nutshell. Deep affection shadowed by relentless, sometimes brutal rivalry. The goal was always dominance, even over your own brother when he was at his weakest. Joe Sr. weaponized their natural competitiveness to ensure maximum effort toward the dynastic goal. If you wanted the love, you had to win.
Okay, let's talk about Joe Sr.'s drive for wealth, which was relentless and utterly unbound by conventional morality. The ultimate proof of this is his involvement in prohibition. Despite living far from poverty and aspiring to this refined Brahmin society, he saw the illegal activity as a massive, immediate financial opportunity.
This is a perfect link back to that baseball story. Joe Sr. did not care how he won. His father, PJ, had been a liquor wholesaler, which gave Joe Sr. immediate access to crucial logistical contacts in Canada and England. The sources indicate there was testimony suggesting Joe delivered merchandise offshore to known bootleggers.
What's the specific evidence that ties him to this? Is it just testimony?
No, it's more than that. The sources point to official documents. In 1926, the Canadian Customs Commission investigated massive liquor export tax fraud, and the name Joseph Kennedy was linked to numerous key documents detailing these shipments. Now, Joe Sr. was never legally charged, but the paper trail strongly suggested his deep involvement in exploiting this massive illegal financial channel. He was operating in that gray space between legitimate import-export and outright smuggling, laying the financial foundation for the dynasty on cash earned outside the law.
That pragmatic approach extended to avoiding service during World War I, a time when 371 of his Harvard classmates died for their country. Joe Sr. saw war not as a moral obligation, but strictly as an economic opportunity.
He successfully avoided the draft board by arguing that he was indispensable to the war effort as a young executive. When the draft board questioned this, his powerful boss traveled directly to Washington to ensure Joe did not have to serve. This ensured he was away from the trenches during a time of immense economic boom.
And he didn't just survive, he profited immensely.
Absolutely. He secured a massive salary, lucrative bonuses, the exclusive right to run the canteen for his own profit, and, most importantly, key contacts. He learned that Bethlehem steel was a stock a smart man had better get into. He used the chaos of war to deepen his financial empire while his peers were sacrificing their lives. This pattern of leveraging national crises for personal financial gain is a hallmark of his career.
After finance and prohibition, Joe Sr. makes his move into Hollywood. This was both a shrewd financial venture and a profound personal education that provided insights he later applied to political maneuvering.
Yes, he got involved with FBO films. And in Hollywood, he learned one of the most crucial lessons he later instilled in his sons about group loyalty. He saw how the Hollywood Jews, despite competing fiercely among themselves in the studio system, stood together against the Gentile world, viewing this collective clan loyalty as their strongest weapon. Joe Sr. consciously adopted this us versus the world clan mentality for the Kennedy family.
And of course, Hollywood also introduced him to Gloria Swanson, beginning an assignation that was far more than a simple erotic diversion.
Oh, much more. The sources are unequivocal. He descended on her life and took it over, managing every aspect of her professional existence, from her scripts to her financial statements. This was a relationship of total control, not just romance. It was also public and completely brazen. He even invited Gloria to Hyannis Port, where his family was staying.
And here's the detail that truly elevates this beyond a simple affair into something chilling. Years later, a bugging microphone was found embedded in the ceiling of Gloria's dressing room.
Presumably placed there by Joe.
Right.
That detail is explosive. It suggests a level of paranoia, or more accurately, a desire for total information control that extends far beyond a typical illicit relationship. Joe Sr. was gathering intelligence on every aspect of his environment, even his lover, showcasing the ruthless extent of his need for absolute leverage.
And the family was certainly aware of the rumors. His daughter Kathleen wrote a letter asking for a signed picture of Miss Swanson and inquired about little Gloria, the actress's adopted daughter. The fact that the children were asking points to how openly Joe Sr. flaunted his indiscretions, forcing Rose and the children to endure this public humiliation for the sake of his ambition.
Finally, we have to address his catastrophic role as ambassador to Britain, which ended in infamy largely due to his political isolationism and open, devastating anti-Semitism.
The candor Joe Sr. possessed, that willingness to say the unspeakable to secure an advantage, it was turned against him here. He told the German ambassador, Herbert von Dirksen, that he fully understood the plight of the misunderstood Nazis.
And he advised Dirksen to minimize the image problem. He said their issue wasn't the desire to get rid of Jews, but the loud clamor it was causing. This was not subtle prejudice. He openly claimed she understood completely, noting that at a specific golf club in Boston, no Jews had been admitted for the past years.
Yeah.
He also openly admitted that he was impressed by the great things Hitler had done for Germany. This politically toxic rhetoric entirely compromised his effectiveness and forced his eventual recall by Roosevelt. The man who sought Brahmin legitimacy compromised himself with vulgar, damaging prejudices.
So if Joe Sr. built the dynasty on raw ambition and unchecked greed, the emotional and physical cost was paid by his sons. And this was particularly true for Jack. His entire adult life was a constant struggle for health and a desperate attempt to appear worthy of his father's true manhood ideal.
Jack had a veritable dictionary of illnesses. Beyond the weak knees and bad arches, he suffered from overwhelming chronic back pain, persistent intestinal problems, and the underlying serious threat of Addison's disease, a condition where the adrenal glands fail to produce enough necessary hormones.
So his greatest political creation wasn't a policy or a speech. It was the illusion of health.
Precisely. The sources state this was his greatest creation. Maintaining a robust tan, exercising rigorously, and constantly making jokes about his condition to deflect sympathy. He was actively deceptive about his problems because weakness was the one thing the dynastic culture could not tolerate. To admit weakness was to fail his father's definition of manhood.
And despite this profound physical frailty, Jack desperately sought active military duty during WWII. He even called Senator David Walsh for help getting reassigned to a PT boat squadron after being judged unfit for strenuous service.
This demonstrates the relentless internal drive to prove himself, often contradicting his own physical capacity. His dedication to testing himself was as brave as it was foolhardy. There's a story of him being hospitalized after sailing an unstable boat in hazardous conditions. It was a constant search for an authentic heroism that could stand up against Joe Jr.'s natural athleticism.
And that search led to the defining moment of the Kennedy legacy,
Yeah.
the sinking of PT-109.
When a Japanese destroyer cut their boat in half, Jack, despite his debilitating back condition and weak arches, performed an act of raw, physical courage that became legendary. When a sailor, McMahon, was too weak to swim, Jack tied the strap of McMahon's Mae West life jacket, put it like a bit in his teeth, and pulled the sailor for 5 hours through the water to safety. This was not the act of a privileged inheritor. It was an authentic display of willpower overriding physical limitation.
And the sources confirm this experience fundamentally transformed his viewpoint. Before PT-109, Jack was somewhat cynical about the American as a fighting man and about Washington rhetoric.
But the experience, breaking the bread of life with non-privileged men from modest circumstances for the first time, gave him an essential new authenticity. He became a patriot, but in an anti-heroic mood. He questioned Washington's easy use of words like sacrifice and courage, recognizing that the men back home who used those words so lightly rarely had to put their own lives on the line. He learned that while Americans were ready to give their blood, many in power fixed the system so they didn't have to give their sweat.
But this heroism was deeply resented by his older brother, Joe Jr. He felt the immense burden of being in the sickly Jack's shadow, especially after Jack's fame eclipsed him.
Joe Jr. had always believed being the first son was his natural right to the highest achievement. When he heard Jack had been rescued and was achieving public fame, he was paralyzed by bitterness. He couldn't even bring himself to call Hyannisport. His letters home were just these plaintive cries for recognition. Look at me, look at your other grown-up son, your first son.
The rivalry was intense. It extended to all aspects of their lives, even bragging about sexual conquest.
Right. Joe Jr. bragged about dispersing his first team of women, advising Jack to use the magic name of Kennedy incognito in Norfolk. He desperately needed to win at something Jack couldn't touch, and that drive was fueled by his sense of obligation as a child of immense wealth. He felt he had to prove himself worthy of his rich bounty of life.
And that need for validation drove his decisions as a pilot. He was a merciless perfectionist who refused to be satisfied flying, lumbering reconnaissance craft.
He wooed heroism, stalking it. He actively sought out the most dangerous assignments because only the highest risk could confer the high honor he desired. He was so driven by the need to outshine Jack that he volunteered for a mission that no rational pilot would take.
And that stalking proved fatal. Joe Jr. was not required to stay after his mandated 35 missions, but he insisted on being there for D-Day and his moment of heroism. He agreed to fly the highly dangerous experimental bombing mission, Operation Anvil Aphrodite,
which involved flying a heavily explosive-laden, drone-like aircraft that was meant to be bailed out of right before impact. And the sources revealed the devastating calculation. Joe Jr. had lied to his family about asking his crew to stay on. He took unnecessary risks to fulfill the dynastic expectation of heroism. His plane exploded in an immense yellow circle of flame over the North Sea, a consequence of his own traits: great physical courage and stamina, and a complete confidence in himself which never faltered. The irony is just profound. Joe Jr.'s desperate perfectionist quest to be the perfect Kennedy killed him, leaving Jack, the sickly, cynical second son, as the unintended, final dynastic heir.
So now the burden of the dynasty shifted entirely to Jack. While he had proven his physical courage, his private life was defined by a specific type of emotional distance and continuous self-testing that mirrored his father's calculation.
He identified deeply with the Whig hedonism of Lord Melbourne, whom he read about extensively. Melbourne was famously a skeptic in thought, in practice, a hedonist. For Jack, loyalty was strictly reserved for friends and family, the temple of the Kennedys, not for spouses or lovers. Pleasure was treated as an aesthetic treat, totally detached from emotional commitment.
And his constant serial womanizing was a subject of fascination even for his friends. The sources suggest it wasn't primarily about sex itself. The act was often a quick release.
The primary function of his assignations was psychological. It was about testing his power and charm and will. His friends observed that Jack didn't fear sexual impotence as much as he feared the possibility that the Jack Kennedy he had created wouldn't work anymore. Each successful conquest was a validation that his persona, his engineered image of command and attractiveness, was still potent and effective.
And this calculation carried over directly into his early political decision-making. Most notably, the infamous McCarthy censure vote. While he was recovering from surgery, Jack failed to vote, and he drew immense criticism from those who viewed McCarthy as a moral blight.
Jack just scoffed at them. He scoffed at those who saw this as a great moral, ethical issue. He famously said, hell, if you get into the question of just disapproving of senators, you're going to be in some difficulty. He considered himself aligned with 90% of the senators who just wanted to avoid the conflict. It was a classic Kennedy pragmatic retreat.
But the sources suggest his father's shadow was involved here too, wasn't it?
Oh, it absolutely was. Joe Sr. maintained crucial contacts that ensured McCarthy, who was a formidable enemy to many, wouldn't attack Jack. So Jack got to avoid taking a difficult, potentially career-damaging moral stand because the political cover provided by his father allowed him the luxury of inaction. He was protected from the consequences of avoiding principle.
The ultimate test of the Kennedy machine's calculation, though, had to be the 1960 West Virginia primary against Hubert Humphrey. This campaign was crucial because Jack's Catholicism potentially made him unelectable.
West Virginia was the make-or-break moment. The Kennedys viewed it as a baptism by fire in raw, systemic corruption. They knew they had to prove a Catholic could win in a heavily Protestant state, and they were willing to throw everything into the fray, especially untraceable cash.
We need to unpack the specifics of this financial pipeline because the difference in spending was just astronomical.
It was almost laughably unequal. The money was primarily cash, delivered discreetly to bribe local sheriffs, who were effectively local political bosses controlling votes, especially in the rural areas. Joe Sr.'s wealthy friend, Eddie Ford, drove down in a Cadillac with a suitcase full of money. This wasn't standard campaign finance. This was a covert operation to buy political leverage.
And the detail about the two briefcases in Logan County is just extraordinary.
It's the perfect illustration of Joe Sr.'s doesn't care how he wins. Philosophy applied at scale. Jack's people intended to pay a local operator, a man named Chafin, $3,500 to put Kennedy's name on slate cards, a standard low-level bribe. They mistakenly paid him $35,000, 10 times what was requested, delivered in 2 separate briefcases. The sheer quantity of cash just overwhelmed the local system. To contrast, Hubert Humphrey spent only $25,000 on his entire primary campaign. The Kennedys were operating with an entirely different currency.
And beyond the cash, they employed dirty tactics to neutralize Humphrey.
They did. Jack's staff provided Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was campaigning for Jack, with information about Humphrey not serving in WWII documentation, which Roosevelt then made public. It was a vicious, calculated attack targeting a rival's patriotism, designed to smear him in a state full of veterans.
And Joe Sr.'s cynicism just loomed over the entire operation, confirming that this was his machine at work.
Definitely. Joe Sr. made his own arrangements over and above the campaign staff. There's the famous anecdote where Joe told an aide to pick up a valise of money. When the aide noted $10,000 was missing, Joe replied with his characteristic pragmatic philosophy, "In politics, money does not grow in the passing." This showed his acceptance that this level of corruption was simply the transactional cost of political acquisition. West Virginia proved that the Kennedy machine, using calculated corruption and overwhelming resources, was unstoppable.
Jack finally achieves the pinnacle, the presidency, but the price of maintaining that illusion of health while in the world's most stressful office was immense. The management of his physical health became a state secret, requiring a dangerous cocktail of drugs just for him to function.
He suffered overwhelming chronic back pain. This necessitated cortisone injections, which were also physiologically required to manage his Addison's disease, that chronic failure of his adrenal glands, which control crucial stress hormones. But he learned to manipulate this powerful drug. Too high a dose risked serious side effects, including muscular weakness, high blood pressure, and psychological effects like agitation, euphoria, insomnia, even psychosis.
And this was compounded by his relationship with Dr. Max Jacobson, the famous Dr. Feelgood. He was a German-Jewish refugee who treated the president, often seeing him more than once a week.
Dr. Jacobson operated with this mystical knowing aura, administering injections that often contained amphetamines. Now, while the liquid was later claimed to test negative for stimulants, the recklessness of having the President of the United States dependent on shots from a doctor known to use speed, a doctor the CIA eventually investigated, is just staggering. Dr. Snyder, Eisenhower's former doctor, even observed JFK at his inaugural address and hypothesized he had taken a double shot of cortisone to appear vigorous on that cold day.
So the famous image of the vigorous new frontier president was, to a very large extent, chemically maintained. And the reason for this maintenance links right back to the dynastic core.
Absolutely. To Kennedy, true manhood was everything, and that required a demonstrable image of being vibrant, active, physical, and sexual. He needed the injections to appear demonstrably energetic, masking the reality that his adrenal glands had completely atrophied.
And that need for performance sometimes failed him privately.
Yes. The sources detail how debilitating his condition could be. He required naps to get through the day, and sometimes he was so physically compromised by the pain and the medication regimen that he had to foist John Jr. off on an aide because he literally could not bend down to pick him up. The performance of strength was essential, but the underlying reality was constant managed weakness.
That performance of strength was severely tested by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Although Kennedy accepted blame publicly, the private recriminations were harsh and led to an intense shift in strategy, with Bobby becoming the enforcer.
Privately, Kennedy was furious and humiliated. He blamed the failure on the fucking brass hats and the limp-wristed, effete diplomats at the State Department. The Kennedys, seeing the loss as a humiliation for the family name, immediately intensified covert efforts, Operation Mongoose, to overthrow Castro. This was driven by a deep desire to avenge the family's honor against a guy like Castro.
This desperation led to the most shocking partnership of his administration, the mob connection. The CIA was so desperate that they partnered with major mob figures, Rosselli, Trafficante, Giancana, to attempt an assassination via poison pill.
And Joe Sr.'s vast, unsavory contacts in organized crime were actually a key link in this unsavory partnership. And this is where Jack's private indiscretions came full circle, creating a massive political vulnerability.
How exactly did Jack's relationship with Judith Exner create leverage for the mob?
Well, Giancana, the powerful mob boss, was content to share Exner with Kennedy, knowing that his knowledge of their affair might prove to be a free pass. Giancana understood that if he was caught, or if he wanted political protection, the knowledge of the president's dalliance with a mob-linked mistress was explosive. It gave him direct leverage over the most powerful man in the world, a risk Joe Sr. had cultivated by prioritizing sexual conquest over discretion.
Bobby, meanwhile, acted as the president's brutal and completely loyal right arm, purging the administration of those who failed the Bay of Pigs test.
Bobby's cold-blooded efficiency was stark. After the failed operation, he dismissed the rest of the advisors in the room to Admiral Burke, telling him the president would rely solely on Burke because, in Bobby's words, the rest of the people in the room weren't helpful. This demonstrated the family's profound, absolute loyalty only to those who delivered results and their ruthlessness in discarding those who failed.
Moving to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the ultimate test of Jack's presidency. The tension in those ex-com meetings was enormous. Kennedy surrounded himself with intelligent men, which allowed for necessary dissent against the Joint Chiefs.
The ability to listen to dissenting opinions was absolutely key to avoiding nuclear war. When George Bundy asked if the installation of MRBMs in Cuba substantially changed the strategic balance, Secretary of Defense McNamara replied, "My personal view is not at all." This directly contradicted the Joint Chiefs, who had argued that it changed the balance substantially. This objective, calm analysis allowed Kennedy to resist immediate military action.
And JFK's strategy was immediately to look for a non-military out. He recognized the military options were catastrophic.
Kennedy repeatedly suggested trading the Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the Soviet missiles in Cuba. He saw this as the only viable face-saving out for Khrushchev, even as his military advisors bristled at trading Allied assets for Soviet withdrawal. He was willing to be pragmatic over hawkish.
In the critical moment, the secret negotiation that sealed the deal was handled by Bobby. Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin recalled that Bobby was in a state of agitation, displaying genuine, visceral fear.
Yes, Dobrynin observed that Bobby was almost crying when he was condemning the Soviets as hypocritical, misleading, and false. This showed a genuine, raw fear for the survival of his family and the world. This emotion was authentic. The human cost of the crisis was visible on Bobby.
But even in that moment of peak global crisis, the political calculation was paramount. Bobby delivered the message with a strict caveat.
Yes. The secret deal about removing the Turkey missiles was contingent on one thing. Bobby explicitly told Dobrinin that this deal could not be made public as his prospects could be damaged if this secret deal were to come out. The Kennedy dynasty and its future political viability were protected, even as the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The family's need for political survival trumped complete transparency about the high-stakes compromise.
The dynastic pressure weighed heavily on the younger brothers as well, particularly Teddy, who began his career defined by academic misconduct and the overwhelming burden of the Kennedy name.
Right. At Harvard, Teddy was caught cheating on a Spanish exam. The sources detail how his friend, a scholarship student who could ill afford the consequences, agreed to take the exam for him. When they were caught, Teddy exhibited what was described as calculated passivity, believing he was less morally culpable if he had given no command. Both were expelled for a year. This pattern of using others and minimizing his own culpability would recur throughout his life.
And when he launched his 1962 Senate bid at age 28, he had virtually no credentials beyond his family's wealth and fame.
He genuinely worried about being portrayed as a wealthy, personable lightweight, which, was a fair assessment. The family machine had to work overtime to manage this image deficit.
The ultimate ritual showcasing this dynastic weight was his wedding.
Teddy initially wanted Father John Kavanaugh, a close family friend, to officiate, making it a personal event. However, shortly before the ceremony, he abruptly changed his mind. He chose to marry under Cardinal Spellman, the most celebrated Catholic leader in America. This was done because, as the sources note, it had to be a dynastic wedding. The personal choice was completely secondary to the political optics necessary to advance the family brand.
Finally, we turn to Robert F. Kennedy, whose journey was arguably the most profound transformation within the family. He moved from a ruthless cynic, who often mirrored his father's worst traits, to the leading moral force of his generation.
As Attorney General, Bobby was initially disliked by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Bobby was aggressive, however, and sought to move agents away from tracking informants in the non-existent domestic Communist Party toward organized crime. He recognized that Hoover had never had an AG who didn't kiss his ass, and Bobby refused to defer to him, immediately challenging the FBI's established priorities.
And his initial views on social issues were deeply colored by his father's biases.
They were. He initially showed his father's stereotypical views toward American Jews, writing that Zionist spokesmen were doing immeasurable harm because they hadn't spent enough time with their own people. But his time in office forced a dramatic evolution on civil rights. He developed a genuine, visceral reaction to segregation.
What specifically triggered that visceral change?
It was direct confrontation. The sources cite a moment in Savannah, Georgia, where he insisted blacks be seated at a segregated hotel dinner where none were previously allowed. This was not a policy move. It was a personal, emotional reaction to injustice that his father's pragmatism could never have accounted for.
And the ultimate symbolic action that fused politics and morality came during the 1960 campaign with the Martin Luther King Jr. call.
After King was arrested and moved to a high-security prison, JFK initially refused to release a strong statement, wary of alienating Southern voters. But after King was moved, JFK called the governor of Georgia to discreetly arrange his release on bond.
And then Bobby stepped in to provide the crucial personal touch.
Bobby then called Coretta Scott King, believing, as his advisor noted, that the passionate Kennedys never show their passion, and that they desperately needed a symbolic action to cut through the political cynicism. This call, a small act of personal reassurance and engagement, was a profound political gesture that won the Black community's support and helped shape the destiny of the family, demonstrating that Bobby had moved beyond his father's calculated ruthlessness toward genuine strategic idealism.
So when you look at the whole picture, it's fascinating. The immense pressure from this immigrant patriarch demanding true manhood and relentless success to the ruthless political demands of the era, it ultimately molded and defined the Kennedy men, often tragically.
It really did. They built an empire on calculated ambition, on Joe Sr.'s foundational lesson that money and leverage could buy anything, including virtue and social standing. They operated on an illusion of health and a willingness to use any means, financial bribery, mob connections, leveraging personal vice, to achieve their vision of power.
And their private lives, filled with chronic illness, serial philandering, dynastic competition, even bugging microphones. It was a relentless shadow cast over their brilliant public achievements.
Yeah. And they found their deepest and fiercest loyalty only within the temple of the family into which no outsider could truly enter.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? When you reflect on how Joe Sr. engineered his son's environment-forcing competition, demanding physical perfection, and concealing Jack's debilitating conditions with drug cocktails, it raises an important question. To what extent was the immense political success of the Kennedy family built not on inherent robust strength, but on the desperate, brilliant, and chemically assisted maintenance of profound weakness? Go explore that thought. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.